Alright, what up? I had to switch my area a little bit, so I'm basically at the crib on the back of the porch, but I'm just gonna continue speaking on where I left off at. Cause I had to, upload those videos, and then I'm using the original phone that I used at first. So it took me a while to get all that uploaded. Now I had to erase everything on this phone just to create more memories, so I could do another hour potentially. So this is just real life circumstances, but I'm not using no notes or nothing like that. This is all off the top. But I left off talking about, I was about to go into 1850, but I wanted to speak on the context as far as 1850 now. 1850, according to the census, because I looked this up, because what's coming up now as far as in the book is Harriet Beecher Stowe, and that famous book that she had came out with called Uncle Tom's Cabinet, or not Uncle Tom's Cabin, that talked about the realities of slavery or whatnot. So during this, portion of my study or whatnot, I wanted to know the population numbers again, just to, keep up with everything that's going on as it leads toward the Civil War. Now, as far as 1850, I believe the total population of the United States was 21 million people, and it was 3.6 million black folks with about 434,000 slaves. Even like 10 years after this point, when you go to 1860, the population increases to like 33 million. But as far as like the black population, it increased by like, I think, 3,000 people, 300,000 people, because it was 3.9 million black folks. And as far as slaves, it was still under 500,000. So going back to 1850, this is the context back then. Now, as far as like the whole racial dynamic that's going on, because you got bleeding cancers that's going to kind of like culminate in about 6 more years after this. But at the same time, you still got, included with the whole debate about slavery, this whole thing about new territory and states that get enlisted into the Union. And, people was arguing whether or not slavery should be expanded, especially outside the Southern territory or whatnot. The Southerners wanted that to be the case, to go to these new territories and people to have the right to have slaves there, etc. And then as far as new states into the Union, them also having slavery as a part of the institution that they sustain. So that was the debate that was going on. This debate had been going on for about 50 years as far as like the added portions of new territory. That whole thing started with the Louisiana Purchase. That's something that I spoke on the last historical blog. Not my last blog, but the last blog about American history. And I was talking about John Quincy Adams. That was like in 1803 as far as when the Louisiana Purchase took place. You know what I mean? Which, of course, gave way to these other states and territories and things like that, like with Michigan, etc. So anyway, that's the whole ongoing debate that is going on. So like as far as Harriet Beecher Stowe, I forget the name of the newspaper, but it was like a whole bunch of different essays about the realities of slavery that was going on. And it was kind of like a hit. A lot of people was reading it and whatnot. So like in 1851, she decided to put it out, to have it published in a book. And it became a precedented bestseller, basically. The first year alone, it sold 300,000 copies. And it was supposed to be something that was real significant. And then outside of America itself, I think by like 1857, it sold 2 million copies outside of America alone, in Europe and Asia as well. Now that was a big deal. Now when I looked it up, I understood as far as like what I read about it being notable, but I wanted to compare it to something else. So ironically, I was watching a documentary recently, sometime last week, and it was about Hitler. And they was basically trying to figure out like the sources of his book, like the inspiration of his book, where did he get some of his sources from, etc. His book Mein Kampf. And they was talking about how like he came out with the book in 1925, but it wasn't really that successful till later on, around like 1940s or whatnot. Probably slightly before that, but anyway, like it ended up, he ended up selling like at least 50,000 copies. All right, so it was decent as far as his career, him gaining recognition. It was supposed to be some type of measurement, So it was relatively a decent success. Now I'm looking at the population of Germany just to make sure. I looked it up. At that time, their population was 69 million people. You know what I mean? Before it got cut down to no, it was uh 60. It was 69 million. 69 or was no 68 million and 900,000 people. I think something like that, but it was up there 68, 69 million people, and he only sold 50,000 copies of the book. So going back to 1850, damn near 100 years before that, you know what I'm saying? I'm looking at that, I'm like, damn, that's pretty good, 300,000 copies. So again, just me looking at as far as like the sociological context. Now I'm trying to measure still up until 1850. Now I'm still keeping in mind, like, you know, the argument that I had the opportunity to read in its most purest form from a direct source, going back to that guy Harper Williams. Now I'm putting this in context. I'm trying to understand, like, how deep was racism in America, at least back then. And I came up with the conclusion, once again, I'm like, okay, it was deeply rooted, but it was different levels of it. You know what I'm saying? Depending on the region and how the dynamics played out, and whether there was a threat there or things were just operating smoothly, so there's no reason to be alarmed and bring out your negative side, etc. So basically what I'm saying is, I'm like, okay, the literacy rate in the United States is pretty good. Now you're talking about 1850, 23 million people at most. Actually, it's 21 million people. 21 million people. 300,000 copies compared to Germany, 50,000 copies, 68 million people. So it was a big discussion at the same time going on around this period. And, you know, I'm trying not to say consciousness, but you could say at least by 1850, you know, there was a consciousness that was woke out there. Not that it greatly mitigated racism. You know what I'm saying? Now I'm looking at it like, okay, going back to the essay as far as Harper Ferry and hitting it from that perspective. He basically said that, like, when you look at the global playing field, right? You look at all the major nations around the world during that period. Because by that time period, slavery had been outlawed by many different nations in Europe, etc., right? So here in America, as far as the white man, there was some type of like unconscious embarrassment of its existence here as well. And he was saying, like, a lot of people will contradict themselves, and like a lot of people that own slaves, that underlining embarrassment was the reason why a lot of them gave their slaves up when they died. Like George Washington, for example. You know what I'm saying? To me, that was, it's hard to explain it because I understand it, but to me, that was like sort of deep. I was thinking about that. I'm like, wow. Because me trying to figure out like the whole sociological measurement, I'm like, okay, it's just like how, like, I believe a brute exists, etc. Like, there is such thing as a brute. Like, a racist person absolutely exists, but you also have, you know, I don't want to use the term benign, but I would say like benign racist individuals. But that's because like the circumstances of like for example, you can think about the total number of slave uprisings, which is supposed to be 250. Now, just in 1850 alone, it's 3.6 million slaves. You only got 250 uprisings, all right, historically speaking, all together during the whole entire existence of slavery. 250 documented uprisings. Now, as far as like what I mentioned earlier, I feel like it doesn't take away from any of that. But what I'm saying is that because racism existed and the uprisings wasn't like in a fucking millions of anything like that, the majority of slave masters wasn't forced to go to the brute extreme because of that. But it doesn't mean that they did not internalize and harbor. I think it wouldn't be naive to think that this wasn't the case. that they uh, did not internalize or harbor deep-rooted racism, even if like your interaction with the opposite race is benign and extremely cordial and friendly and all that type of stuff. You know what I'm saying? You still got those like unwritten rules, like the black codes, for example, that came after the Civil War. You know what I'm saying? Well, really after the period Reconstruction, so basically after the 1870s. But that was like a de facto example of the underlining codes of conduct as far as behavior is concerned. Like the black codes, for example, that wasn't in no fucking law books, is what I'm trying to get at. It wasn't a sign, just kind of like how you couldn't go in certain bars or certain places, certain businesses, certain bathrooms, you couldn't drink out of certain fountains. That was the law, right? It wasn't like a fucking sign as far as like hold your head down, etc. Come through the back door, you know, you walk. That type of stuff didn't, like, it wasn't overtly described for you to do that. You already knew to do that. But the whole thing is that's still post-Reconstruction. All right? So if those attitudes existed post-Reconstruction, this is after slavery. Okay, everything else that takes place after that, just to keep it simple as snowballs, that's fine. But you're talking about these set of codes that's understood after slavery. So definitely when you go back then and you consider the fact there was only 250 uprisings, still you talk about like the personal intimate relations and interactions between the slaves and their masters, so-called. Even if nothing brute had happened, you still got that inferiority thing in the air that's still going, kind of like saying like you know your place, basically. Is where I'm getting at. So because her book sold 300,000 copies, that's why I feel like that was real significant, because it gave me an opportunity to kind of like measure the racial dynamic. Like I know it existed, but just how deep and in what type of way, shape, what type of ways, basically. You know what I'm saying? And then the guy Harper Williams actually helps because he hit it from a raw form, even though radical and racist, but it's still a perspective in this raw that I was able to read directly and kind of like bounce some of my ideas upon. So I don't know, it was just, so I think it existed, but it's like the different types of, like, for example, okay, like I mentioned John Quincy Adams earlier. I don't think he was racist in that sense, but I do think he also internalized the grief of it, because he did operate within the society of it, even though he spent his childhood, a young adult years in Europe or whatnot, but still, when he came back to America, he still professed later on that he believed in manifest destiny. For example, the Louisiana Purchase that I brought up, that was one of the themes or one of his premises for why he felt like it was constitutional at the same time. You know what I'm saying? So he did have a little bit he did have some of it that rubbed off on him. But lucky for him, he had such an exotic existence from the beginning. You know, he was, you could say, how can I put it? Like, his, having to be around it constantly as a child growing up and it being right in his face is something that's normal, especially, you know, being the fact that he has conveniences growing up because he was a part of an elite in a sense as well. You know, I think his experience that could be kind of perceived as exotic to the norm a little bit kind of helped mitigate the full effects of it, but I do think he still internalized some of it. Still, it was inescapable. Somebody like John Brown, like I said, him being raised in Idaho amongst Native American families for the most part, and then everything that I read about his life, even outside that book, I would have to say it's hard for me to even envision somebody like him inside of a room and having that atmospheric shit connected to him. You know what I'm saying? Especially like the brutal murders that he committed later on that I'm going to touch on in a second. So I definitely think he's an exception. And if I was to make a comparison between him, even though, you know, he killed people and John Quincy did not physically, if I had to say which one was more racist between the two or less racist, I would have to say John Brown, which is ironic, but based on everything that I just explained, it makes the most fucking sense because he also, like I say, he also has an exotic background, and I would say a little bit more exotic in a sense than what John Quincy Adams had. So that's the difference. You know what I'm saying? In other words, somebody like him will have the most pure heart from racism. You know what I mean? John Quincy Adams, again, extremely benign, but you could see my point when I say like a degree of it being ingrained is inescapable. Even if somebody like him, for example, included his father before him. Now, Abraham Lincoln, even before he became president, even before he ran for president, even before 1858, with them famous debates between him and Stephen Douglas, right, took place in Springfield. Even Abraham Lincoln, for example, repeatedly throughout his life was consistent. Even up into, the beginning stages of his presidency, he said he does not believe in the spread of slavery. He doesn't think the institution should be built upon should be spread outside of where it existed back then. All right. But he did also say, and he said this also in 1858 in those debates too. I'm trying not to speak on those debates yet because I'm keeping this in chronological order. But he did also say on record plenty of times that he didn't believe in emancipation, and he didn't think like both races were, equal, and he thought it would be odd if they were to mix and match. Even like the judge that I brought up earlier, Samuel Sewall. Even him, for example, the guy that wrote, a tract, as they call it, called "The Selling of Joseph," which was his opinion about the guy Adam, that guy enslaved for life or whatnot, or tricked into being enslaved for life or whatnot. Even like that, for example, like that guy, he's the first in American history to write something publicly against slavery. And it was in like 1700 exactly when he published it or whatnot. But even though from his point of view, he was saying it's like morally wrong and biblically wrong, and that every human being, regardless of who they are, has the right to liberty, and slavery is something that's completely not natural for any human being. That was his argument, 1700. This is way before Harper Ferry or whatnot. But he still was a segregationist. He still did not believe in the intermingling of the races. He just didn't believe that one race should be able to subjugate another race in bondage. You know what I'm saying? That's just what. But he did say like there was a peculiarity between the two. Now I thought that was interesting. So again, as far as like this racism whole thing, I think if you somebody at least back then that wasn't, I mean, you could have had a good heart and all of that, but you still got those how can I put it like that, backdrop in the atmospherics of how you expect somebody of a different color that's black, if you're white, to act around you. I believe that shit is true. Like when I think about it, like a lot of abolitionists and all them, I think everything was cool, but I bet you when it came to behavior, it was a lot of odd shit that went on, and people would be able to sense arrogance or whatnot. But it's hard for me to explain that. Like I don't want to just be like, okay, that's your bad side, but you're fighting against it. But that's pretty much what the fuck it is. You know what I'm saying? I was just trying to find a more proper way to put it or whatever. So that was the case as far as her. Again, in the book, when they brought up her book or whatnot, and they were saying it was a bestseller, and they helped the conversation. That's when they brought up like, the opposite literature. A lot of Southerners who wrote opposite opinions against what she had to say, and that's how I came across that guy Harper Ferry, other people such as Du, etc. And luckily, like I say, the literature, that book, Pro-Slavery Arguments Maintained, came out only 2 years after hers, but it was far much less of a success as her book was. So that happened. Okay, so about like, let me see. 1856, bleeding Kansas is going on. And you got a lot of people called the roofies. Basically, you had like, okay, the Kansas Nebraska Act that got passed made it to where like people within this territory, Kansas for example, they'll be allowed to vote on whether or not they wanted slavery a part of the territory or not. So a lot of people that lived in Missouri across the border, close to the border, got upset about that. So they would ride into these settlements and then harass the people that were anti-slavery and etc. So a lot of conflict and battles and shit like that happened. Like I think the people were called ruffians who would ride into these territories and do this, and then those who would respond were called joy hawkers, if not in reverse. But one time in Lawrence, Kansas, I think this is also 1856. It was about like 600 fucking night riders, 600 pro-slavery advocates basically that rode into this town and harassed the people there, and they damaged all kind of property and destroyed buildings. I think one person ended up dying from a collapse of a building, or almost died or something like that. So, the people, as far as because they came into Kansas from Missouri, I believe. But anyway, in response to that, this is when John Brown comes up. Actually, he responded to two events. It was another event that took place May the 21st between two congressmen. It was a guy named Charles Sumner and then another guy named Preston Brookes. This guy, Preston Brookes, he was a Southern congressman. He assaulted this guy, Charles Sumner, beat him with a cane or something like that, gave him some injuries that took him weeks to get over. And this is what they was arguing about, this whole thing about slavery being spread to new territories, or if it should not be spread to these territories. So, that was a little physical confrontation that happened. As far as John Brown, he responded 3 days later on the 24th. That's when he rode into this place called Pottawatomie, Kansas. And he ended up killing a whole entire family. He had some of his sons with him too. Because like I say, he had 13 kids in total. He had some of his sons with him. They ran into somebody's house, a particular family's house. The old man, I think the owner of the house, or the oldest guy, or at least the father, his name was Dole or something like that. And it was about like 5 of them in total. They all was taken out. The older guy, Dole, he got shot point blank in the face by John Brown. The rest of his sons and them, they all got shot up and hacked to death, basically. 5 of them died. Then John Brown ended up on a run because of that, never got caught. At least until like the Harper's Ferry raid. Now from that point, that's when he became a very popular figure. In fact, like based on the book, The Civil War, Legends and Lies, he was the most popular figure during this time up until Abraham Lincoln got elected. That's when Abraham Lincoln became the most popular figure, and still John Brown was second to that. That I didn't know. You know what I mean? Because I remember, I think I was a junior, I had U.S. history, and we was on this subject, and the teacher was teaching about it, and he brought up John Brown, but I remember the way he was teaching about him, he was saying like, the guy was just, he actually took this position back in the day as far as a teacher. He was saying John Brown was just, not just considered, but actually was a crazy man. And this is, I think, like the incident in Pottawatomie, Kansas, this is the one that he brought up. He mentioned how this guy had blew off somebody's head or whatnot. But the way that he taught about him, he never, I don't recall ever him, John Brown being considered somebody like he was mentioned as a person in history, but I never too much recall him being considered that popular. You know what I'm saying? Next to somebody like Lincoln. You know what I mean? Because there's many people like Frederick Douglass got brought up so many times to me in my life. It's Harriet Tubman, all kind of people. John Brown for sure, but not too much. So I didn't know that he was that popular, at least back then on record. So he was a fugitive from that point. So, like 2 years later after that, in 1858. No, actually, I'm skipping something. 1857. That's when the Dred Scott decision was made. Now, as far as Dred Scott himself, it was him versus Sanford. This is interesting Just like how Harper Williams, how I mentioned how he talks about like a lot of these people back in the day toward the end of their life, they'll just go ahead and free their slaves or just give them up to somebody else. And by the way, even in this observation, Harper Williams was kind of hard. She was like, that as far as like them just trading them to a different slave master before, the death of the original slave master. Harper Williams was like, that's even more worse for the Negro itself. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, as far as him talking about like these people doing this because deep down inside they feel sort of embarrassed because when you look at the global playing field, they almost feel ancient to that. You know what I'm saying? So as far as like Dred Scott, it was a similar situation with him. He sort of fits the mold as far as his original slave master. This is why I think this. During his case, even though it had made it through various courts, first the federal court before the Supreme Court, and this is something that had started, I think, at least 11 years before that. So this would have to be 1846. All right. Originally, he was from Missouri, right? His slave master, I forget the guy's name too. He had ended up moving or visiting, at least, as they put it, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. At that time, Minnesota wasn't a state, so it was just a territory, right? And Illinois was a state because I think Illinois became a state in 1819. 1819, as far as Wisconsin, I think 1837, or at least around this time. But anyway, this guy had visited these states. What ended up happening, he died. When he died, his wife tried to sue to get Dred Scott back, meaning his wife either wasn't with this guy when he made these journeys, either they were already separated, or she was, or she was still around or whatnot, but still remained in Missouri, but expected to kind of like receive Dred Scott in return as kind of like a property, like the rightful heir to this property or whatever. But the weird thing to me is this: the guy that helped Dred Scott sue was the son of the slave master himself. So I'm like, wait a minute. So this is all they pretty much were just describing the dates and shit. I'm thinking about this. I'm like, wait a minute. If this is his son, then that means Dred Scott had a really good relationship with the slave master, and that relationship was already sustained to that degree way before the guy left Missouri. So he had to have had it good in Missouri too. In other words, like almost kind of, basically for the sake of argument, being like treated like an equal. You know what I'm saying? They're getting used to it, at least back then. And when the guy died, the wife didn't expect to free the guy somehow. I don't know if the wife, like I say, I don't know too much as far as like the context as far as the original slave master and the wife. But whatever it may have been, whether they were together or not, her actions leads me to believe that she was being sort of petty or whatnot. You know what I'm saying? But even aside from that, when you exclude her, Dred Scott had to have had a decent relationship with the original slave master, and maybe they had some type of understanding that he was going to be free. I think that's more than likely the case, especially if the slave master's son helped Dred Scott, sue for his freedom, even though he lost, because ultimately the chief of the Supreme Court at the time was a guy named Roger Taney. And he ruled against him, and he set a precedent and struck down the Louisiana Purchase, basically saying like it was unconstitutional in the first place for the United States to outlaw slavery in these territories or whatnot, and then went further and declared the reason why Dred Scott lost his case is because he's black, and it was never intended for a black person of African descent to benefit from the laws of the Constitution, any of the laws of the Constitution. That was fuck. I mean, I know, you know what I'm saying? Of course, you learned this in school or whatever, but this is what I'm thinking at the time. Like, Abraham Lincoln's election or whatever. The reason why the reason why the United States the reason why this is so fucking crazy to me. I feel like maybe it's something I'm missing, I'm forgetting or whatnot. But later on, I'm gonna mention this real quick. When Abraham Lincoln got elected, you know, while he was running, actually, he kept saying that he was not going to allow slavery to be spread to new territories or whatever. If the Dred Scott and the Dred Scott decision, well, a part of the Dred Scott decision, like I say, he declared the Louisiana Purchase, for example, to be illegal, and for you know, like I say, outlawing the expansion of slavery in these new territories to be illegal. So I'm like, if that's a rule created by the Supreme Court, how is it possible? I'm just looking at this a certain way. How is it possible for a president, period, to be able to strike it down? You can't just veto the shit. You know, it's weird. But anyway, that's the decision that they got made, and that's when things started boiling over. Even more and more fighting starting to go take place, more killing, etc. So like in 58, in 1858. That's when you had the situation in Verona, Missouri that took place. Now, by this time, John Brown is also friends with both Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. And he had helped these people. Like, he went to Verona, Missouri, and I think he invaded 2 farms. And he freed a total of 12 slaves. After he freed them, you know, he put them along the routes of the Underground Railroad to freedom or whatnot. And then around this period, at the same time, he was planning his great raid in Virginia, in Harper Ferry, Virginia. So he had spent time at Frederick Douglass's house, you know, mapping out how he was going to do it. Because the way he was going to do it, he was going to run into Harper's Ferry, like he was going to cut the town off or whatever. Then he was going to go straight to like the armory or whatever. It was a few buildings, you know what I'm saying, that consisted of the United States armories. I mean, this complex. It was a complex, basically. So after he, you know, take his certain amount of weapons or whatever, and then, you know, free whoever he frees, they were supposed to have ran off into the Allegheny. I think how you say that, it's like the Allegheny Mountains, which runs through Western Virginia, and then all the way into Pennsylvania or whatnot. That was a part of his plan. That's what he was planning at Frederick Douglass's house. In fact, at this part in the chapter, this is where this is when they had referenced Nat Turner saying that John Brown learned his lessons from him damn near 3 decades before or whatnot. Almost 3 decades before or whatnot. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, during this time, he tried to get like Harriet Tubman also